This video is brought to you by Mubi, a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from around the globe. Get a whole month free at mubi.com/broedationl. I have a podcast called Rehash. I co-host it with my friend Hannah, and it's all about internet phenomena that gets us all up in arms, only to forget about them within a week. So we rehash them, as they say. We're launching our 5th season this month, which is all about what happens when art meets the internet. Is the sun rising on a new creative era, or has it already begun to set? Go check it out. Inspired by recent events in my life and on this earth, and from the writing of this video, I have decided to keep a journal. Spring has flitted by in Toronto, and like the past several years now, summer has come upon us white hot. I wear sandals today. Each summer is hotter than the last. Each year, a tarmac melts, a species dies, the grass is yellow, and the air is poison. I won't lie, the sun is a temporary comfort. But as I sweat twisting in my sheets at night, I recall the words of the poet Antonio Machado. What have you done with the garden that was entrusted to you? Even the darkness cannot hide my consternation. On one of these sleepless nights, I went up to the attic to watch a movie. This one, which had been waiting on my watch list for a long time, was First Reformed by Paul Schrader. You can imagine how shocked I was to discover that its protagonist, the melancholic Reverend Toller, seems to share my anxieties. For 1 hour and 50 minutes, I sat frozen with grief, sinking further into despair, until I didn't. When I turned off the movie, I found that some of my sadness had lifted. I felt rejuvenated, like I had stepped beyond a barrier, like there was before First Reformed and after it. I ask you, journal, why had this movie unburdened me from my woes? Who is Paul Schrader? You may know him as the writer of Taxi Driver, one of the most iconic movies of all time. You may know him as everyone's favorite Facebook dad and self-proclaimed Swiftie, or maybe you know him from his vibrant podcast interviews. While Schrader may not be as familiar a name as the director of Taxi Driver, Martin Scorsese, he's very well respected and prolific within the industry. And while he's made a breadth of different movies, his filmography is often characterized by its focus on male alienation, or as he puts it, God's lonely men. And in a way, First Reformed belongs to this canon.
You take this character when he was young, he was lonely, he was a taxi driver. And then he was narcissistic and he was a gigolo. Then he was anxious and he was a drug dealer. Then he was superficial and he was a society walker. And now lastly, he is in despair and he is a reverend. And so there is a kind of arc, but it's not a necessary arc. It's just that the arc is determined by life experience on my part.
But when you put First Reformed next to Schrader's other movies like American Gigolo or Hardcore, let's say, which for all their solitariness are pretty action-packed and visually dynamic, First Reformed seems like a pretty huge pivot, especially this late in a career.
We're in the endgame now.
It's not unusual for a director's filmography to change as they climb into their later years. Hayao Miyazaki, for example, who for the past 2 decades has said that each new project will be his last, and whose whimsical films have always been far outside his own perspective, has gotten more self-reflective as time goes on, with The Boy and the Heron being a semi-autobiographical account of his childhood. The change is abundantly clear with Martin Scorsese, whose films have gotten more grand and sprawling each passing decade, with his 2 most recent films, The Irishman and Killers of the Flower Moon, pushing well past the 3-hour mark. Schrader, who is 77 today and was around 70 at the time of making First Reformed, actually commented on this change with Scorsese, saying, "That's probably the biggest difference between me and Scorsese. Marty really is a believer in more is more because that's Catholic in a way. let's just do more. Let's have a big parade, a bigger church. I come from a tradition where less is more, and in fact, even less is most. With this less is more approach to First Reformed, Schrader is following in the footsteps of directors he has always revered. People like Ozu Yasujiro and Robert Bresson, whose films became more and more stripped down as they got on in age. What's most interesting is that before he wrote Taxi Driver, Schrader wrote a book about the films of Ozu and Bresson all the way back in 1972 at the tender age of 24, called Transcendental Style in Film, a style of filmmaking he had never himself attempted until First Reformed. Why? Schrader was raised in a strict Calvinist household, where church was regularly attended and all popular entertainment was banned, including movies. He actually once recalls that whenever he did something wrong, his mother would prick his finger with a pin and remind him, "That's what hell's like," all the time. And as writer Sean Nam notes, a childhood like Schrader's established the grounds for an acutely introspective, tortured sense of self and original sin, qualities conducive to his artistry. So it's no wonder that he was drawn to the austere films of Ozu and Bresson at such a young age. He saw something spiritual in their austerity, which is what led him to write Transcendental Style.
I remained curious. What was the connection to the world in which I was then living and the world which I had come from? In certain films, I sensed a kind of link between my past and my present, between the sacred and the profane, between the spiritual life of the Christian and the commercial life of a film. But that link was not content, it was style.
To understand why First Reformed packs the punch that it does, and even why Schrader took so long to make a film like it, we have to understand Transcendental Style. And that's a tough one, but I'll break it down for you as best I can. Schrader starts out his book by explaining that the transcendental is something that can be found in both religion and art, and that transcendental expression in religion and art attempts to bring man as close to the ineffable, invisible, and unknowable as words, images, and ideas take him. And he uses these directors to explain how the transcendental appears in film, Ozu in the East and Bresson in the West. Transcendental style is characterized by, like I said, austerity. Shots are tightly framed, the camera is static, meaning no dollies or lifts or pans, the rhythm of the film is carried only by cuts, which are slow. Actors, at least in Bresson's films, are non-professional. Music is used sparingly and is often diegetic, meaning that it occurs within the environment of the film. And dialogue is delivered in a stilted, monotone way, allowing the language to speak for itself. Ozu and Bresson were also extremely formalistic, using the same techniques routinely in their films, which is very different from what Schrader has done in his own career, changing genres and styles with every film he makes. But for Schrader, the repetitiveness of their techniques isn't a sign of amateurism, like it would be for a less skilled director. Instead, it evokes ritual, the repeated motions of religious practice through the language of film. All of this comes together to bestow a certain feeling upon the viewer: transcendence. Schrader writes, Transcendental style stylizes reality by eliminating, or nearly eliminating, those elements which are primarily expressive of human experience, thereby robbing the conventional interpretations of reality of their relevance and power. Not all films in the Transcendental style are the same, but you can pick one out if it more or less follows these three stages. The everyday, a meticulous representation of the dull, banal commonplaces of everyday living. Ozu transitions his scenes with long takes of mundane settings, a passing train, the exterior of a building, a field of oil drums. Bresson zooms in on close-ups of minute tasks. He also does something called doubling, which is a device that makes a scene redundant. Our narrator will say what he did yesterday, and then we watch him doing it in the next shot. Like I said, there's little to no music, little to no camera movement, and the shots can be so tightly cropped that a subject will move out of the frame, but the camera won't move to accommodate them. This is meant to remove all expression from life and amplify its coldness. Disparity, an actual or potential disunity between man and his environment, which culminates in a decisive action. Both Ozu and Bresson were men at odds with the world around them. Ozu in the rapidly Western culture of post-war Japan, which is something he explores in Tokyo Story, a film about the impact that American occupation had on traditional Japanese family dynamics. Bresson had spent over a year as a prisoner of war in World War II, and was also a very spiritual person, which made him such a singular force in the world of French filmmaking. It also influenced his commitment to non-commercial work, and questions about the body and the soul that come up so often in his films. In the films of Ozu and Bresson, often comes a moment where the protagonist can no longer bear the coldness of everyday life, and decides to step outside of it. And lastly, there's stasis, a frozen view of life which does not resolve the disparity, but transcends it. These films don't tend to have happy endings. Instead, once our character has exited the world of the everyday and entered the world of despair, we end on a still shot. Whether that's the smoking steak in Joan of Arc, or the train in Tokyo Story, or the cross in Diary of a Country Priest, or the hallway in Late Autumn. Ideally, once the image stops moving at the end of a Transcendental Style film, the viewer will keep moving. The goal is for them to transcend beyond the events of the film and into something greater, something spiritual. Schrader says, stasis, by showing a static, quiescent, organized scene, reinforces this newfound idea of life. If successful, stasis transforms empathy into aesthetic appreciation, experience into expression, emotions into form. But it's important not to confuse a Transcendental Style film for a religious one. For Schrader, religious films spend too much time trying to get the viewer to empathize with the suffering of the characters. They're manipulative, whereas Transcendental Style films leave it all up to the viewer to decide. You also shouldn't confuse their lengthy still takes for experimental works, which Schrader says are too sparse and don't build up any spiritual momentum. So how does First Reformed evoke the Transcendental Style? First Reformed is about the young but sickly reverend of a historic church in Albany County, New York, named Ernst Toller. His church has low attendance and subsists mainly as a tourist spot. But one day, one of his parishioners, a pregnant young woman named Mary, seeks guidance from him about her husband Michael, who wants her to get an abortion. She arranges a meeting between Toller and Michael, and we learn that Michael is a climate activist and also a depressive who expresses his fears about bringing a baby into this rapidly dying world. This conversation between Toller and Michael is truly one of the most riveting exchanges in film history. It commands all of your attention. Toller's tired spiritual counsel is reinvigorated and shaken by Michael's spirited rationale. He later writes in his journal,
I felt like I was Jacob wrestling all night long with the angel. Every sentence, every question, every response a mortal struggle. It was exhilarating.
While Toller does his best to show Michael the light, Mary soon after shows him a suicide vest she found in their garage, and before they can have another meeting, Toller discovers Michael's body in a park with a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. This event, along with a potential cancer diagnosis, and finding the company of his church's financial backer on an environmental watch list, sends Toller further and further into despair. He resolves to wear Michael's vest to his church's upcoming reconsecration ceremony, but at the last minute takes it off when he sees Mary going into the church. Instead, he wraps himself in penitential barbed wire, puts on his alb, and is about to drink a glass of drain cleaner when Mary interrupts him. They passionately kiss, and then we cut to black. Anyone familiar with Ozu or Bresson can see the influences in First Reformed. You'll notice it's shot in a 1:33:1 aspect ratio, which Schrader calls a distancing effect, meaning that there's no room on either side of the frame, so you don't have to fill it up with unnecessary stuff on the side. We also spend long amounts of time with Reverend Toller in complete silence, which is at times extremely disquieting, and at others oddly peaceful. Rather than being realistic, the dialogue is heightened. And in preparation for the film, Schrader told Ethan Hawke and the other actors to restrain their performances, so much of the dialogue is delivered quite frank and monotone. Narratively, First Reformed is very similar to Diary of a Country Priest, focusing on a young religious leader who runs a remote church, suffers from stomach cancer, and becomes increasingly alienated from the world around him. It also follows the 3 stages of Transcendental Style. We start off with the everyday. The script explicitly notes that our film opens on still images. a church exterior, a historical marker, a door, brochures. We have shots of Toller carrying out everyday tasks in his minimalist home. We have shots that linger on a scene long before or after the action has happened. There isn't exactly doubling. Toller will often elaborate on his own thoughts on an action while it's happening.
Mary and I rode the park trail. I had not ridden a bicycle, I think, in 20 years.
Or actually omit from his journal the less savory things that he's doing.
I suddenly feel much better. I awoke early, clear-headed.
This just serves to highlight how distanced Toller is, not only from the world around him, but from himself. Then we move into disparity, where we cast suspicion on the everyday. As Toller descends into despair and alienation, the film changes form. The moment of true disparity for me comes when Toller and Mary do an exercise to help her with her anxiety, and the two of them float over images, first of the beautiful natural world, and then of ecological damage and pollution. Here, Schrader does something that's much more out there than Ozu or Bresson. Like I said, he calls a moment like this a decisive action, which breaks the everyday stylization. The country priest is alienated by his sickness, by his parishioners who don't respect him, and by the world of sin around him, all three of which Toller himself experiences. But we see this alienation visualized cinematically. The moment when he falls out of the everyday realm altogether is the moment when the film's sparse and ascetic style is broken. Then we have stasis. This looks a bit different in First Reformed than in Ozu or Bresson's films. Instead of a still image, we go from a slow-motion revolving shot of Toller and Mary kissing to a black screen, and then the credits roll. With the cut to black, everything is open. Did Toller and Mary get together? Did Toller die? We've exited all realms. We've entered the meditative state. In his review of the film, Justin Chang called First Reformed a despairing, fully sustained howl of a movie. I can still hear that howl today. It's seldom that a movie truly confronts not only the death of our planet, but the psychic toll that this will have on the people who inhabit it. In his book, Schrader argues that in films of transcendental style, there is, in this stage, an inexplicable outpouring of human feeling which can have no adequate receptacle. It may be that transcendental style is the only adequate receptacle for the enormity of this moment. First Reformed reckons not only with a dying world, but the death of the human spirit. Interestingly, the film, both in its austere style and in its themes, challenges our initial instincts with climate change. As Schrader says in an interview, it is very easy to fall into despair, and you have to make a decision not to. One scene that brings this to light is a conversation between Toller and the leader of the Abundant Life Church, Pastor Joel Jeffers, where Jeffers chastises Toller for withdrawing from public life.
You're always in the garden. Even Jesus wasn't always in the garden.
Both Michael and Toller respond to impending climate catastrophe by turning inwards, inflicting the pain of the world onto themselves. Toller lives a very restrictive life. His home is bare, he barely eats, but he does drink relentlessly and self-harm. My friend Seb drew a parallel in his review of the film between Toller's pollution of his own body and the pollution of the earth, which I think is very apt. Toller's hero in the film is a Trappist monk and theologian named Thomas Merton, who once said that the great crisis of the modern man is his refusal of himself. He wrote, "The Church, in her wisdom, realizes that the greatest danger comes from the power of negation that is latent in this great and powerful society of ours." So this film does not endorse Toller's self-flagellation because it recognizes that extreme self-discipline or asceticism won't do us any good. As Merton argues, in every man there is hidden some root of despair, because in every man there is pride that vegetates and springs weeds and rank flowers of self-pity as soon as our resources fail us. But a man who is truly humble cannot despair, because in the humble man there is no longer any such thing as self-pity. This is something I find so interesting about First Reformed. The entire purpose of transcendental style is asceticism, to be as disciplined and austere as possible in the creation of a film. Yet the film is directly critiquing the asceticism of Toller. So why is this style so important for getting across this message? Well, as Schrader puts it, when you start withholding things, people become a little uncomfortable, and out of that discomfort, out of that disparity, you can start to weave another reality. The Transcendental Style pairs so well with the subject of climate catastrophe for this and a couple other reasons. It mirrors both the late-stage artist, Ozu, Bresson, Schrader, and also humanity in its later stages. First Reformed asks us what stage we're in today. Are we in disparity? Have we entered stasis?
As your life progresses and as you face different circumstances, you find yourself returning back to certain characters and see where they fit in this new constellation of experience.
What is the character of us? That's the question I find myself asking as I stare at the blank screen. I am at odds with this present moment. Schrader remarks in the book that the reason Bresson and Ozu, however different they may seem, are so similar is that they were both men experiencing culture shock. Their traditional heritages were in decline, and so both men worked to reverse that with Transcendental Style. For Schrader, Transcendental Style takes old aesthetic principles, the formalism, the rigidity, the solemnness, and brings them into a new art form: film. To me, these were men using style to navigate their cultural climates. And the same can be said for Schrader. In an updated version of his book, Schrader writes an intro where he goes through the evolution of Transcendental Style in the decades since he first spoke about it. Directors like Tartovsky and Bela Tarr and Chantal Akerman ushered in a new, very similar style called slow cinema, which is still very popular today. But these films don't have the spiritual undercurrent that Transcendental Style films do. With the deaths of Ozu and Bresson, this specific style fell by the wayside a bit, until it was revived, according to Schrader, with Ida, a 2013 Polish film by Paweł Pawlikowski about a nun who sets out on a road trip with her Jewish aunt to find the bodies of her parents who were killed in the Holocaust.
And then about 3 years ago, something started to change. And I was having a conversation with Paweł Pawlikowski, who had done Ida. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about spirituality in film and the new economics of film. And I walked home to my apartment in New York, and I said, it's time. It's now time to write that script you never thought you would write. You never said you would write.
Ida is extremely austere, devoid of color, using only diegetic sound, and very tightly cropped. And it inspired Schrader to finally go ahead and make a Transcendental Style film of his own. So in a way, Schrader is also reviving aesthetic principles with First Reformed, and grappling with his own questions about the disrepair of contemporary culture. So does Toller die? Does he enter stasis? Of course, it's up to you, the viewer. As Schrader told an interviewer, even if that is an ecstatic vision that he has while dying, I guess that is a redemptive one. And the Lord's grace does come down and fill the room, even if Mary was never there. If Toller doesn't die then, he likely will soon. And yet he exits the everyday, leaves behind his despair, and enters stasis. This is where the film released me from myself, left me with a feeling of acceptance. Olivia Hunter Wilkie says this in her review of the film. In acceptance of abomination, these figures find freedom. In this freedom, Reverend Toller sees reflection in those also seeking, able to recognize intimacy in the face of extinction. Love is welcomed at the threshold of inescapable annihilation, and all will end in the embrace of our concomitant Apollyon. In many ways, Schrader is different from other directors today because of his spirituality. First Reformed is not optimistic, but it's compassionate. Rather than descending into nihilism about climate change, which his film threatens to do, He leans into stasis, maybe even catharsis. He grasps for meaning in the darkness and transcends it. This video is sponsored by Mubi, a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from all around the globe. It's for lovers of great cinema, and those who don't know they love great cinema yet. Because the beauty of Mubi is that it exposes you to artful, thought-provoking, and innovative films you would never think to watch. If you watched this video and were interested in watching a Transcendental Style movie, it's your lucky day, because Ida is now streaming on Mubi as part of their Modern Masterpieces series. At its very surface, Ida is a road movie, but brimming beneath is a very haunting look at the remnants of a country devastated by war and grappling with its own marred history, all through the lens of a girl's coming of age. Ida was an immediate sensation when it came out in 2013, and its legacy continues to grow. If you want a truly transcendental experience, I suggest you give it a watch. Discover the best of cinema at your fingertips, streaming anytime, anywhere. You can try Mubi free for 30 days at mubi.com/broedeschanel. That's mubi.com/broedeschanel for a whole month of great cinema for free. Special thank you to Syed Hassan, Malpertui, Morgan, Cooper Stimson, Nadia C., Nick, Jenny Eller, J. Frost McFinnigan, Gabriel M., The Wiz Daniel, Edward Yu, Andrew Nguyen, Connor O'Keefe, Sharma, Daniel Sardunas, Jenya, Ryan Blythe, Maya Kameva, Naomi Nakagawa, Scott Barnett, Julia Campana, Alexis, Nafis Bullock, Carrie Gavin, RSS, Fridtjof Holstrom, Alex Short, and Kelly Wolf for supporting this channel.